The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Adelaide Cottage, casting gentle shadows across the comfortable sitting room where Princess Catherine sat with a sketchbook balanced on her lap. It had been 3 months since her surgery, and the world had grown accustomed to her absence from public life. The official statement spoke of recovery and rest. But behind the carefully worded press releases, something unexpected was happening. Catherine had always been known for her grace under pressure, her perfect smile at royal engagements, and her dedication to early childhood development. But now, removed from the constant scrutiny of cameras and the demanding schedule of royal duties, she was discovering parts of herself that had been buried beneath years of protocol and expectation. The sketchbook before her was filled with drawings that no one had seen yet. Sketches that revealed a talent she had quietly nurtured since her university days at St. Andrews. Her fingers moved confidently across the page, creating the outline of a garden she had been imagining. Not just any garden, but a therapeutic space designed specifically for children dealing with serious illnesses. The idea had come to her during one of her many quiet afternoons, when the house felt too still and her mind too active. She had always believed in the healing power of nature, but her convalescence had given her a deeper understanding of what it meant to find peace in simple, beautiful things. William had noticed the change in her immediately. Where others might have expected his wife to be frustrated or anxious about her forced absence from public life, he instead found her more centered than he had seen her in years. She would spend hours in her private sitting room, surrounded by books on landscape architecture, child psychology, and horticultural therapy. Her notebook was filled with careful annotations and ideas that connected her long-standing passion for early childhood development. With this new interest in healing gardens, the children had adapted to having their mother home more, though they didn't fully understand why. George, Charlotte, and Louis had grown used to finding her in unexpected places around their home, sometimes sitting by the window with a book, other times working on her sketches at the kitchen table. She had become more present in their daily routines, helping with homework, listening to their stories about school, and joining them for simple activities that her previous schedule had often prevented. One particular afternoon, Charlotte had wandered into her mother's sitting room and discovered the sketches spread across the desk. Her young eyes had widened with curiosity as she examined the detailed drawings of pathways winding through flower beds, small pavilions designed for quiet reflection, and play areas integrated seamlessly with natural elements. Catherine had explained her vision patiently, watching her daughter's face light up with understanding and excitement. From that moment, Charlotte had become her mother's unofficial assistant, offering suggestions with the unfiltered creativity that only a child possesses. She proposed that the garden should have secret corners where children could hide when they felt scared, and bridges over small streams where they could throw flower petals and make wishes. Catherine had written down every suggestion. Recognizing the profound wisdom in her daughter's innocent observations, the project had started as a private pursuit, something to occupy her mind during recovery. But as the weeks passed, it had evolved into something more substantial. Catherine had begun reaching out quietly to experts in various fields, conducting video calls from her home office with landscape architects who specialized in therapeutic spaces, child psychologists who understood the needs of young patients, and directors of children's hospitals who could envision how such a space might benefit their facilities. She had been careful to keep these activities private, conducting her research and planning without the knowledge of the press or even most of the palace staff. This was something she needed to develop on her own terms, without the pressure of public expectation or the weight of royal protocol. Her private secretary knew, of course, and William was fully supportive, but beyond that small circle, the extent of Catherine's new project remained a closely guarded secret. The more she worked on the project, the more she realized how much her own experience with illness and recovery had shifted her perspective. She had always been empathetic, but there was a difference between understanding something intellectually and knowing it in your bones. The vulnerability of being unwell, the strange mix of boredom and anxiety that came with convalescence, the way time seemed to move differently when you were removed from your normal routine. All of these experiences had given her insights she couldn't have gained any other way. She had started keeping a journal during her recovery, not about her illness itself, but about the small discoveries she was making. She wrote about how the quality of light at different times of day could affect her mood, how the sound of birds outside her window had become something she looked forward to each morning, and how the simple act of watching plants grow had given her a sense of connection to something larger than herself. These observations were finding their way into her garden designs, informing choices about sightlines, natural sounds, and the placement of seating areas. One evening, as she was working on a particularly detailed section of her plans, William had come to sit beside her. He had watched quietly as she explained how she wanted to create spaces that would allow children to feel both protected and free. Areas where parents could find moments of respite while still being close to their children, and pathways designed to encourage gentle movement and exploration, even for those with limited mobility. He had listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions and offering his own observations from his air ambulance days. When he had seen firsthand the toll that serious illness took on families, their conversation had stretched late into the evening, and by the end of it, they had decided that this project was worth pursuing seriously. It was no longer just a private interest to occupy Catherine during her recovery. It had the potential to make a real difference in the lives of children and families facing their own difficult journeys. The decision to move forward had brought a new energy to Catherine's days. She began reaching out to potential partners and supporters, carefully crafting her vision into a proposal that could attract the necessary funding and expertise. She worked with architects to create more detailed plans, consulted with medical professionals about the specific needs of pediatric patients, and began identifying possible locations for the first garden. What started as a way to cope with the isolation of convalescence had transformed into a mission that felt deeply personal and profoundly important. Catherine knew that when she eventually returned to public life, she would be different, not diminished by her experience with illness, but enriched by it, carrying with her a new understanding and a concrete plan to turn that understanding into something beautiful and healing for others. The first person outside her immediate circle to truly understand what Catherine had been working on was her brother James. He had come to visit one afternoon in early spring, finding his sister in the garden at Adelaide Cottage with her hands in the soil, planting bulbs with an intensity that surprised him. She had always enjoyed being outdoors, but this was different. There was a purposefulness to her movements, a careful attention to the placement of each bulb that suggested she was working on something more than simple gardening. James had settled onto a nearby bench, content to watch and wait for his sister to explain in her own time. Catherine had always been private about her projects until she felt ready to share them, and he respected that quality in her. After nearly an hour of companionable silence, broken only by occasional observations about the weather or the birds, she had finally sat back on her heels and begun to tell him about the healing gardens. Her voice had been quiet at first, almost tentative, as if she was still testing whether this idea could survive being spoken aloud to someone outside her most trusted circle. But as she described her vision, her confidence had grown. She explained how her time away from public duties had given her space to think deeply about what truly mattered, and how her own experience with recovery had opened her eyes to the profound impact that environment could have on healing. James had listened with growing admiration as his sister outlined her plans. He knew her well enough to recognize when she was onto something important, and he could see in her eyes and hear in her voice that this project had become central to her sense of purpose. When she finished speaking, he had offered something she hadn't expected: his expertise. As someone who had built a successful business and understood the practicalities of turning vision into reality, he could help her navigate the complexities of funding, partnerships, and implementation. Together, they had spent the rest of that afternoon creating a timeline and identifying the key challenges they would need to address. Catherine needed to balance her recovery with the development of this project. She also needed to consider how and when to make it public. The royal household had protocols for charitable initiatives, and there would be questions about why she had been working on this privately rather than through established channels. But Catherine had made a deliberate choice to develop this project on her own terms first. She had spent years working within the constraints of royal protocol, And while she respected those structures, her convalescence had shown her the value of having something that was genuinely hers. Not the Princess of Wales supporting a cause, but Catherine herself creating something from her own experience and vision. The challenge of maintaining privacy while developing a major project had required careful strategy. Catherine had learned to conduct her research during times when household staff were occupied elsewhere, to take her video calls in rooms where she wouldn't be overheard, and to keep her extensive notes and drawings in a locked cabinet in her private office. It wasn't that she didn't trust the people around her, but she knew how quickly information could leak, and she wasn't ready for public scrutiny. While the project was still taking shape, her physiotherapist had noticed the change in her energy levels and mood as the project developed. During their regular sessions, Catherine had been more engaged, more motivated to regain her strength, because she now had a clear purpose driving her recovery. When asked what had shifted, Catherine had simply smiled and said she had found something worth working toward. The physiotherapist had been perceptive enough not to push for details, recognizing that whatever was motivating her patient was having a positive effect on her rehabilitation. As spring progressed, Catherine's research had deepened considerably. She had read studies on the psychological benefits of nature exposure for hospitalized children, examined case studies of successful therapeutic gardens around the world, and spoken with parents whose children had spent extended periods in pediatric care. Each conversation and each piece of research had refined her vision, adding layers of understanding and nuance to her initial concept. One particularly meaningful exchange had been with a mother whose daughter had spent 18 months undergoing treatment for leukemia. The woman had described how the hospital had a small courtyard that her daughter could see from her room, and how watching the seasons change through that window had given her daughter a sense of normalcy and hope during the darkest days of treatment. That conversation had reinforced Catherine's belief that these gardens needed to be designed, not just for children who could go outside, but also for those who could only experience nature from their hospital beds. This realization had led to a whole new dimension of her planning. She began incorporating elements that would be visible and meaningful from interior spaces, designing sightlines that would bring the garden's beauty to children who couldn't physically enter it. She researched window placements, seasonal color schemes that would provide visual interest year-round, and features like bird feeders and moving water that would create activity and sound even when viewed from a distance. The gardens were also evolving to include spaces specifically designed for siblings of sick children. Catherine had learned that brothers and sisters often felt forgotten or overwhelmed when a family member was seriously ill, and she wanted to create places where they could process their own complicated emotions. These areas needed to be separate enough to provide privacy, but close enough that families could easily reunite, offering children a chance to be alone with their feelings without being isolated from their loved ones. Her meetings with potential collaborators had started to reveal the scale of what she was attempting to create. This wasn't going to be a single garden at one location, but rather a model that could be replicated at children's hospitals across the country. Each garden would need to be adapted to its specific setting and the particular needs of that hospital's patient population. But the core principles would remain consistent. Spaces that promoted healing, encouraged gentle activity, provided emotional comfort, and connected children with the natural world. The financial aspects of the project had required Catherine to engage with parts of charity work she had previously left to staff. She was learning about grant applications, corporate sponsorships, and individual philanthropy in much greater detail than she had needed to before. While her position as Princess of Wales would certainly help open doors, she was determined that this project would succeed based on its merits, rather than relying solely on royal connections. She had also begun thinking about the long-term sustainability of the gardens. It wasn't enough to build beautiful spaces. They needed to be maintained properly and integrated into the therapeutic programs of each hospital. This meant training staff, establishing maintenance protocols, and creating evaluation systems to measure the garden's impact on patient outcomes and family well-being. Catherine was thinking decades ahead, imagining how these spaces might evolve and adapt as medical practices changed and new research emerged. The project had also led her to unexpected collaborations with botanists and horticulturists who specialized in plants that were both beautiful and safe for immunocompromised children. She learned about species that wouldn't trigger allergies, plants that could thrive in various climates with minimal maintenance, and flowers that would bloom at different times to ensure year-round interest. These technical details fascinated her, adding another layer to her growing expertise as word of her work began to spread, very quietly among certain professional circles. Catherine started receiving invitations to participate in discussions about healthcare design and pediatric care. She accepted some of these selectively, always under conditions of strict confidentiality, using these opportunities to deepen her knowledge and expand her network of experts. Each conversation added something valuable to her understanding. Whether it was a technical insight about wheelchair accessibility or a philosophical perspective on what healing truly meant, by early summer, Catherine's convalescence had evolved into something that looked quite different from traditional royal recovery. While the public still saw only carefully managed updates about her gradual return to health, behind the scenes she was working with an intensity that surprised even those closest to her. Her private office at Adelaide Cottage had been transformed into something resembling a design studio, with architectural drawings pinned to boards, sample books of materials stacked on shelves, and her laptop constantly open to video conferences with experts. Across multiple fields, the turning point had come during a visit from her longtime friend and former roommate from university. They had known each other for over 20 years, and there was a level of honesty between them that Catherine treasured. Her friend had taken one look at the office, listened to Catherine's passionate explanation of the garden project, and then asked a simple but profound question. Why was she still hiding this? Catherine had initially defended her decision to keep the project private, explaining her need to develop it fully before facing public scrutiny. But her friend had gently challenged this reasoning, suggesting that perhaps Catherine was protecting something else. Maybe she was holding on to the freedom and autonomy that illness had unexpectedly granted her, reluctant to share this piece of herself because once it became public, it would no longer belong entirely to her. The observation had stung because it was partially true. Catherine had grown to treasure the privacy of her convalescence, the rare experience of working on something without the weight of public expectation. But her friend had also helped her recognize that the project's potential impact was more important than her desire to keep it private. Children were suffering in hospitals right now. Families were struggling through impossible circumstances, and she had the resources and position to create something that might help them. Holding back because she wanted to maintain control wasn't a good enough reason. That conversation had catalyzed a shift in Catherine's thinking. She began to seriously consider how and when to make the project public. Consulting with Palace Communications staff about the best approach, there were concerns about how her work during convalescence might be perceived. Would people think she hadn't been truly unwell? Would there be criticism that she should have been resting rather than working? Would the palace be accused of misleading the public about her condition? These were legitimate concerns, but Catherine had begun to see them differently. Her project was evidence not that she hadn't been ill, but that she had found a meaningful way to process that experience. Recovery didn't mean lying in bed doing nothing. It meant finding ways to heal both physically and emotionally. For her, creating these gardens had been therapeutic, giving her purpose during a difficult time and helping her transform a challenging experience into something potentially beneficial for others. She had also started to recognize that her story might itself be valuable to others going through serious illness. The narrative of recovery was often portrayed as simply getting back to normal, returning to who you were before. But Catherine's experience had shown her that sometimes illness changed you, and that change didn't have to be negative. You could emerge different, with new perspectives and priorities. And that could be a form of growth rather than loss. The decision about where to build the first garden had required extensive deliberation. Catherine had received expressions of interest from hospitals across the country, each making compelling cases for why their facilities should be chosen. She had visited several sites personally during short, carefully planned excursions that avoided media attention. Walking through existing hospital grounds and meeting with staff and families to understand their specific needs and challenges, what had ultimately guided her decision was a Combination of practical and symbolic factors. The hospital needed to have adequate space for a substantial garden. Leadership committed to integrating it into their care philosophy, in a patient population that would truly benefit from such a resource. But Catherine had also been drawn to institutions that served diverse communities, wanting to ensure that her first project would demonstrate that healing. Gardens weren't luxuries for privileged patients, but resources that should be available to all children, regardless of their background. The final site selection had been a children's hospital in the Midlands that served a large region with significant economic challenges. The hospital had an underutilized outdoor space that was perfect for transformation. Enthusiastic staff who immediately grasped the potential of the project, and a director who shared Catherine's vision of holistic care that addressed emotional and psychological needs alongside medical treatment. Standing in that empty space for the first time, Catherine had felt absolute certainty that this was where her first garden should take root. Planning the public announcement had been a delicate process. The palace communications team had extensive experience managing royal news, but this situation was unusual. Catherine wanted to be authentic about how the project had developed during her convalescence, but she also needed to be mindful of privacy boundaries regarding her health. They had drafted and redrafted statements, each version attempting to strike the right balance between transparency and discretion. William had been invaluable during this process, helping Catherine think through how to frame her story in a way that was honest without being overly revealing. He understood the media landscape better than anyone, having grown up watching how his own mother's charitable work had been covered and sometimes distorted. His advice was to focus on the project itself rather than making her illness the central narrative, to present the gardens as the story rather than her personal journey toward creating them. As preparations for the announcement continued, Catherine had found herself reflecting on how dramatically her year had unfolded. When she had first begun her convalescence, she had anticipated weeks or months of forced rest, followed by a gradual return to her previous routine. She had never imagined that this period would become one of the most creative and purposeful of her life, or that it would result in work that felt more personally meaningful than anything she had done before. The project had also shifted her relationship. With her role as Princess of Wales, she had always taken her responsibilities seriously, but there had often been a sense of performing a part written by others, of fulfilling expectations rather than following genuine passion. The healing gardens were different. They had emerged from her own experience and vision, and while she would develop them within the framework of her royal role, they felt authentically hers in a way the previous projects hadn't. Her relationship with the public was also something she had been reconsidering. Years of intense media scrutiny had taught Catherine to be guarded, to present a carefully controlled version of herself that revealed little vulnerability or imperfection. But her illness and convalescence had been unavoidably human experiences that couldn't be entirely polished or controlled. She had been forced to show weakness, to step back from duties, to acknowledge that she wasn't invincible, rather than this being the disaster she might once have feared. Catherine was beginning to see it as an opportunity for a different kind of connection with people. Her experience with illness was something many could relate to in ways that royal ceremonies and state occasions never would be. By sharing how she had transformed her recovery into creative purpose, she might offer something more valuable than a perfect public image. A genuine story of resilience and adaptation. The detailed plans for the garden had reached a stage where they needed broader input. Catherine had organized a consultation day where medical staff, patients, families, and design experts would come together to review the proposals and offer feedback. She had been nervous about this session, wondering whether her vision would resonate with the people who would actually use the space, or whether she had been too influenced by her own experience and preferences. The consultation had exceeded her hopes. Parents had responded emotionally to features designed to give them respite without separating them from their children. Nurses had immediately understood how the garden could support their therapeutic work. Children who were shown the plans had responded with excitement and suggestions that Catherine immediately incorporated. A teenage patient recovering from extensive surgery had particularly appreciated the inclusion of private spaces where young people could be alone. noting that hospitals rarely offered teenagers the privacy they needed during such a vulnerable time. The decision to include children in the actual design process had been one of Catherine's most important choices. Rather than simply creating a garden for children, she wanted to create it with them. Over several weeks, she had worked with patients at the hospital, running workshops where they could draw their ideal outdoor spaces, talk about what made them feel calm or happy or brave, and contribute ideas that professional designers might never consider. 1. Young boy recovering from heart surgery had suggested that the garden should have places where you could lie down and look up at the sky without anyone thinking you were sick. He explained that in the hospital, lying down meant you were unwell or tired. But sometimes he just wanted to watch clouds without it being about his condition. Catherine had been moved by this insight and worked with her architects to incorporate spaces specifically designed for sky watching, with comfortable reclined seating, positioned to offer unobstructed views upward. Girl who had been in and out of hospital for years with a chronic condition had contributed the idea of a memory wall, where children could leave marks of their visits. She explained that returning to the hospital repeatedly was frightening, but it might be less scary if there was evidence that you had been brave before and survived. Catherine had developed this concept into a beautiful feature where families could attach small, weatherproof tags to a specially designed wall, creating a growing tapestry of courage and resilience. These interactions with young patients had profoundly influenced Catherine's understanding of what the garden needed to be. She had initially focused on beauty and tranquility, but the children had taught her that they also needed opportunities for normal childhood experiences. They wanted places to play, to feel strong and capable, to have adventures even within the constraints of their medical conditions. The garden design evolved to include elements that challenged and excited children while remaining safe and accessible. The involvement of siblings had also shaped the project in important ways. Catherine had met with brothers and sisters of hospitalized children, hearing their stories of feeling invisible or guilty, of being scared and confused, of desperately wanting to help but not knowing how. One teenager had described feeling like her whole family had moved into the hospital with her sick brother, leaving her behind. Another had talked about the strange mix of boredom and anxiety that came with hospital visits. The hours spent in waiting rooms with nothing to do but worry. These conversations had led Catherine to design spaces specifically for siblings, areas where they could process their emotions, expend energy, and feel seen and valued. There were activity zones where they could be kids, having fun without feeling guilty about it. There were quiet corners where they could cry or rage or simply sit in silence. There were family areas where siblings and patients could interact naturally rather than in the artificial atmosphere of a hospital room. As summer deepened, Catherine's strength had returned substantially, though she remained cautious about overextending herself. Her medical team had been pleased with her progress, noting that having a meaningful project seemed to support rather than hinder her recovery. The purpose and passion driving her work appeared to be energizing rather than depleting, giving her reasons to build strength and maintain momentum in her rehabilitation. She had begun making more frequent visits to the hospital site, always scheduled quietly to avoid media attention. Walk in the grounds where her garden would take shape. She could visualize exactly how each element would fit into the space, how children would move through it, where families would gather, which areas would offer solitude and which would encourage interaction. The abstract plans on paper were becoming concrete reality in her imagination. Fundraising for the project had moved forward with surprising momentum. While Catherine's involvement was still not public knowledge, key potential donors had been approached through trusted intermediaries. The response had been overwhelmingly positive, with several major contributors expressing interest in supporting not just the first garden, but the broader initiative to create healing spaces at children's hospitals nationwide. The project was attracting support because of its clear vision and practical benefits, not simply because of royal association. Catherine had also been working behind the scenes to establish a foundation that would manage the garden's long-term development and maintenance. She wanted to ensure that this project would continue and expand, regardless of changes in her own circumstances. The foundation needed to be properly structured with expert trustees, clear governance, and sustainable funding models. She had been learning about charitable law, endowment management, and organizational development, areas she had previously understood only superficially. One afternoon in late July, Catherine had received a call from a journalist she had known for years, someone with a reputation for thoughtful coverage of royal matters. The journalist had somehow learned about the garden project and wanted to discuss it. Catherine's heart had sunk initially, worried that her careful planning was about to be disrupted by premature publicity. But after consulting with palace communications staff, she had agreed to a conversation, recognizing that the story would likely emerge soon regardless of her preferences. The discussion had been surprisingly productive. The journalist had understood why Catherine had wanted to develop the project privately, and had been willing to hold the story until an announcement could be properly planned. In exchange, Catherine had agreed to provide access and details that would allow for comprehensive coverage when the news did break. They had discussed how to frame the story in a way that honored Catherine's experience without making her illness the focus, and how to highlight the project's substance, rather than treating it merely as a royal human interest piece. This conversation had accelerated planning for the public announcement. If one journalist knew about the project, others would likely discover it soon. Catherine and her team had decided to make the announcement within weeks, coordinating it with the hospital and major donors to ensure everyone was prepared for the attention that would follow. The pressure of an impending deadline brought both anxiety and relief. Soon, the private work would become public, and she would no longer have to guard this secret so carefully. The announcement was planned for early September, timing that would allow Catherine to officially return to public duties while simultaneously introducing her new initiative. The palace would release a statement explaining that during her convalescence, the princess had developed a passion project focused on creating healing gardens for children's hospitals. There would be photographs of her at the hospital site, video of her interacting with patients, and detailed information about the garden's design and purpose. Catherine had worked with the communications team to craft her own statement, something personal and authentic that explained her motivation. She wrote about how her recovery had given her time to reflect on what truly mattered, how her experience with illness had deepened her empathy for children and families facing health challenges, and how the garden project represented her commitment to creating something beautiful and lasting from a difficult experience. The statement walked the line between vulnerability and privacy, sharing enough to be genuine without oversharing details of her medical situation. As the announcement date approached, Catherine found herself experiencing conflicting emotions. She was proud of what she had created and eager to move forward with implementation. But she was also mourning the loss of privacy that was coming. Once the project was public, it would no longer belong just to her. It would be analyzed, criticized, compared to other royal initiatives, and judged by standards beyond her control. The intimate connection she felt to this work would have to make room for public ownership and input. William had sensed her ambivalence and reminded her that this evolution was necessary and right. The project's purpose was to help children and families, and it couldn't fulfill that purpose while remaining private. The loss of intimate control was the price of broader impact, and it was a price worth paying. His perspective had helped Catherine refocus on why she had started this work in the first place, moving beyond her own attachment to the larger mission. The week before the announcement, Catherine had made a private visit to the hospital that would host the first garden. She had wanted one final opportunity to walk the site in relative anonymity, to experience the space as it was before construction began, and to remind herself of why this mattered so deeply. The hospital director had arranged for her to meet with several families whose children were currently receiving treatment. Conversations that would remain confidential, but that would ground her in the human reality behind her plans. One of these meetings had been with a mother whose son was undergoing treatment for a brain tumor. The woman had been exhausted, carrying the weight of months spent living between home and hospital, trying to support her sick child while managing her other children's needs and maintaining some semblance of normal life. When Catherine had described the garden and its purpose, the mother had begun to cry. Not from sadness, but from relief at the idea that someone understood what families like hers needed. The mother had explained that the hardest thing wasn't just the fear and the medical procedures, Though those were terrible enough, it was the way hospital life became your entire world, how you forgot what it felt like to see something beautiful. To hear sounds that weren't monitors and announcements, to smell flowers instead of disinfectant. She described how her son had stopped talking about the future because his present was so consuming, and how she worried that he was losing his sense of himself as a boy with interests and dreams. Beyond his diagnosis, Catherine had listened with tears in her own eyes. Recognizing echoes of her own experience in this mother's words, the isolation of illness, the way it narrowed your world until nothing else seemed real, the difficulty of holding on to hope when every day brought new challenges. These were things she had felt during her convalescence. Though her circumstances had been vastly different from those of families facing pediatric cancer, still there was a shared understanding of what it meant to be reduced to your physical condition. To have your identity overtaken by illness. Before leaving that meeting, Catherine had made a promise. She had told the mother that the garden would be built quickly, that her son would be able to use it, that there would be spaces designed specifically for the experiences this family had described. It was a bold promise that would require her team to accelerate their timeline. But Catherine had known it was the right thing to say. These families had waited long enough for someone to recognize and address their needs. The meetings with patients themselves had been equally powerful. Catherine had brought her sketchbook and had sat with children at various stages of treatment, showing them the plans and asking for their input. Some had been too ill to engage much, offering only brief comments before fatigue overcame them. Others had been energetic and full of ideas, forgetting for a little while that they were hospital patients as they imagined adventures in the garden. Catherine described one girl had asked whether there would be places in the garden where she could be messy. She explained that in the hospital, everything had to be clean and controlled, and she missed being able to dig in dirt, splash in puddles, and generally be a kid without worrying about contamination or infection. Catherine had promised that there would be areas specifically designed for sensory play with natural materials, spaces where being messy was not just allowed, but encouraged, with proper facilities nearby for cleanup afterward. Teenage boy had wanted to know if the garden would have places where he could be alone. He had described the complete lack of privacy in hospital life, how he was constantly observed and monitored, how he could never just be by himself without someone checking on him. Catherine had assured him that the design included secluded spaces where older children could have solitude while still being within safe proximity to staff. She had added that these areas would have mobile signal and Wi-Fi access, recognizing that for teenagers, connection to their friends and normal life often happened through technology. These conversations had reinforced something Catherine had learned during her own recovery. Healing wasn't just physical. It involved reclaiming your sense of self, reconnecting with the world beyond illness, and finding reasons to hope and plan for the future. The garden needed to support all of these dimensions of recovery, not just provide a pretty view or a change of scenery. It needed to be a tool for therapeutic work, a resource for medical staff, and a space where children could experience normal childhood activities. Despite extraordinary circumstances, as the announcement date arrived, Catherine had felt unexpectedly calm. She had done the work, built the relationships, developed the plans, and secured the support needed to make this project real. The public response was now beyond her control, and she had made peace with that uncertainty. Whether people praised her initiative or criticized it, whether they understood her motivation or misinterpreted it, the garden would still be built, and children would still benefit from it. The morning of the announcement, she had dressed carefully in a simple, professional outfit that struck the right balance between royal dignity and approachable warmth. She had reviewed her talking points one final time, practiced answering potential questions, prepared herself for the end of privacy around this project that had been so personally meaningful. William had given her a quiet moment of encouragement before she left Adelaide Cottage, reminding her that she had created something genuinely valuable and that she should be proud regardless of how others responded. The announcement event took place at the hospital, in a room overlooking the space where the garden would be built. Catherine had insisted that patients and families be included in the audience alongside hospital staff, donors, and media representatives. She wanted the people who would actually use the garden to be centered in this moment, not treated as props or afterthoughts in what could easily become just another royal photo opportunity. Her statement had been brief but heartfelt. She had spoken about how her time away from public life had given her space to reflect deeply on what she wanted to contribute, how her own experience with illness had opened her eyes to the profound needs of children and families facing serious health challenges, and how the Garden Project represented her commitment to creating resources that addressed emotional and psychological healing alongside medical treatment. She had been careful not to compare her own experience too directly with that of families facing pediatric illness, acknowledging that her circumstances had been different, while noting the universal aspects of what it meant to be unwell and working toward recovery. She had spoken about the children and families who had contributed to the garden's design, making clear that this was a collaborative effort shaped by the insights of those who would use it rather than imposed from above by someone who thought they knew better. The response in the room had been warm and genuine. When Catherine had finished speaking and invited questions, the first had come from a mother whose daughter was receiving treatment at the hospital. The woman had simply said thank you, explaining that having someone with Catherine's platform recognize and address their needs felt like a validation of what families had been trying to say for years about the importance of holistic care and healing environments. Media questions had been mostly straightforward, focused on practical details about the garden's timeline, design features, and plans for expansion to other hospitals. A few journalists had tried to steer the conversation toward Catherine's health and her experience during convalescence, but she had gently redirected them back to the project itself. She'd been willing to acknowledge that her recovery had influenced her thinking, but she was firm about keeping the focus on the work rather than her personal medical history. After the formal announcement, Catherine had spent time walking through the hospital with patients and families, showing them the site where construction would soon begin and describing in detail how the space would be transformed. She had knelt down to talk with younger children, asking what they were most excited about and incorporating their suggestions even at this late stage. She had embraced parents who were moved by the project, acknowledging their struggles and expressing her hope that the garden would provide some measure of comfort and normalcy. The weeks following the announcement had been a whirlwind of activity that tested Catherine's still recovering stamina. The response to the Healing Garden Project had exceeded all expectations, with offers of support and partnership arriving from across the country and internationally. Other children's hospitals had reached out asking to be considered for future gardens. Landscape architects and therapeutic design specialists had volunteered their expertise. Corporate sponsors had pledged funding far beyond initial projections. The project had clearly touched something deep in the public consciousness. Media coverage had been overwhelmingly positive, though not without some critical voices. A few commentators had questioned whether Catherine's focus on gardens was too soft, suggesting that more direct medical research funding would be a better use of royal influence and charitable resources. Others had wondered whether the project was sustainable or whether it would fade once the initial publicity died down. Catherine had expected these critiques and had prepared thoughtful responses that emphasized the evidence base for therapeutic gardens and the long-term organizational structure she had established. What had surprised and moved her were the personal messages from families across the country who had experienced pediatric illness. They had written to share their own stories, to thank her for recognizing their struggles, and to express hope that their children or future families might benefit from spaces like the one Catherine was creating. She had read every message personally, finding in them both heartbreak and inspiration. Each story reinforced her commitment to ensuring the garden project would be excellent in execution and sustainable for the long term. Construction had begun almost immediately after the announcement, with contractors working to an accelerated schedule to fulfill Catherine's promise to the families she had met. She had visited the site regularly, watching as the empty space was gradually transformed. The first elements to take shape had been the pathways and structural features, followed by planting beds being prepared for the carefully selected flowers, shrubs, and trees that would create the garden's living heart. Catherine had insisted on being involved in many of the planting decisions, working alongside the hospital's horticultural team to select species that would provide year-round interest, support local wildlife, and create the sensory experiences she had envisioned. She had personally planted some of the first trees, working alongside patients who were well enough to participate. These planting ceremonies had become meaningful rituals, ways of literally rooting hope in the ground and creating living symbols of growth and renewal. The children who participated in the planting had approached it with a seriousness that moved Catherine deeply. They had understood that they were creating something that would outlast their own hospital stays, that would provide comfort and beauty for children not yet diagnosed, for families not yet facing the challenges they themselves had confronted. One boy had carefully patted the soil around a young oak tree and said he hoped he would come back when he was grown up to see how big it had gotten. The simple statement had captured everything Catherine hoped the garden would represent: a belief in the future, a connection between present suffering and future healing. As autumn arrived and the garden took increasingly recognizable form, Catherine had begun planning the official opening ceremony. She wanted this event to strike the right balance between celebration and sensitivity, acknowledging the difficult circumstances that brought families to the hospital, while also creating a joyful occasion that children could genuinely enjoy. The planning had involved extensive consultation with hospital staff, patients, and families to ensure the event would be appropriate and meaningful rather than intrusive or overwhelming. The ceremony was scheduled for late October, timing that would showcase the garden's autumn colors and allow Catherine to demonstrate that the space was beautiful and functional in all seasons. In the weeks leading up to the opening, Catherine had worked closely with the hospital to develop programming for the garden, training staff in how to incorporate outdoor time into therapeutic plans and creating resources for families about how to use the space. Effectively, she had also been working with researchers to establish evaluation protocols that would measure the garden's impact on patient outcomes, family well-being, and staff satisfaction. Catherine was committed to demonstrating through rigorous evidence that therapeutic gardens were valuable. Investments in healthcare, not just nice amenities. The data gathered from this first garden would inform the design of future spaces and provide ammunition for advocates pushing for similar resources at other hospitals. The night before the opening ceremony, Catherine had walked through the garden alone as evening light faded and early stars appeared. The space was complete now, transformed from bare ground into the healing environment she had imagined during those long weeks of convalescence. Water features provided gentle sound. Pathways wound through planting beds already showing autumn color, and seating areas offered both gathering spaces and private corners. The sightlines she had worried about worked perfectly, allowing the garden's beauty to be visible from patient rooms, while also creating intimate spaces within the garden itself. Standing there in the quiet, Catherine had reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Her illness and convalescence had been difficult, frightening at times, and certainly not experiences she would have chosen. But they had also given her something unexpected: space to discover what mattered most, time to develop skills and knowledge she hadn't previously pursued, and perspective that had shifted her understanding of her role and purpose. The garden was physical evidence that suffering could be transformed into something meaningful, that difficult experiences could become sources of insight and creativity. The opening ceremony itself had been everything Catherine had hoped. Children had explored the garden with genuine delight, discovering the play areas, sensory features, and secret corners with the enthusiasm she had witnessed during her visits. Parents had found the quiet spaces they desperately needed, sitting on benches overlooking flower beds with expressions of relief at having somewhere beautiful to simply breathe. Medical staff had immediately understood how they could incorporate the garden into their therapeutic work. Already planning activities and programs that would make use of this new resource, Catherine had given a brief speech during the ceremony, keeping her remarks focused on thanking everyone who had contributed to the garden's creation and celebrating what had been accomplished together. She had invited several of the children who had helped design the space to say a few words, and their simple, honest observations about what the garden meant to them had been more moving than anything Catherine could have said herself. One girl had simply stated that the garden made her feel like a regular kid instead of a sick kid, and that single sentence had captured the project's entire purpose. In the months that followed the opening, as Catherine fully returned to her royal duties, the garden had proven its value again and again. Hospital staff reported that patients asked to spend time there daily, that family stress levels seemed to decrease during garden visits, and that the space had become integral to the hospital's culture and identity. Plans for additional gardens at other hospitals had moved forward rapidly, with funding secured and designs adapted to suit different settings and patient populations. The project had also transformed Catherine's public role in ways she was still discovering. She had always been respected and popular, but there was a new depth to public connection with her. People saw her differently now, not just as a royal figure performing duties, but as someone who had faced genuine difficulty and had responded with creativity and purpose. Her vulnerability during illness, combined with the initiative she had shown during recovery, had created a more complete and human public image. More importantly, Catherine felt different about her own work. The Healing Garden Project had shown her that she could operate with more autonomy and creativity than she had previously believed possible within royal constraints. She had proven to herself that she could develop expertise in new areas, manage complex projects from conception through implementation, and create something genuinely original rather than simply supporting causes chosen by others or inherited from royal tradition. Looking back at her convalescence from the perspective of active public life resumed, Catherine could see it as a strange gift. The experience had been challenging and at times frightening, but it had also been transformative. She had discovered capabilities and passions she hadn't known she possessed. She had connected with people in ways that formal royal encounters rarely allowed. She had created something that would continue helping children and families long after she was gone. Something that represented her values and vision in concrete, lasting form. The Healing Gardens had become her legacy in a way that went beyond traditional royal charity work. They represented a model for what royal influence could accomplish when combined with genuine expertise, collaborative design, and sustained commitment. Other members of the royal family had begun asking about her process, interested in how she had developed the project and whether similar approaches might